Orphaned at 13, Tommy Carter was left with nothing but a scrawny brown chicken named Lucy. When the town's wealthiest man laughed at his misfortune, Tommy made a promise. He and Lucy would prove everyone wrong. But could one boy and one chicken really change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. The funeral was small, just like Tommy Carter had expected. Nobody important showed up to say goodbye to John and Mary Carter. They were simple folk who worked at the town's diner their whole lives. Tommy stood alone by their graves, holding the only thing they had left him, a scrawny brown chicken named Lucy. At 13, Tommy was now an orphan. The social workers said he could stay at his parents' small rental house until the end of the month. After that, he'd have to figure something out. The house wasn't much, just a tiny place on the edge of town with a small yard where his mom had kept Lucy, their only chicken. She'd get one egg almost every day, and that egg would go into Tommy's breakfast before school. "What am I going to do, Lucy?" Tommy whispered to the chicken, who clucked softly in response. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He couldn't. He had to be strong now. The next morning, Tommy walked into town with Lucy tucked under his arm. He needed to find work, any work. The first place he tried was Green Valley Grocers. Old Mrs. Peterson always liked his mother. But when she saw him coming with the chicken, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I can't hire someone so young, and you can't bring a chicken to work." She looked at him with pity, which felt worse than if she'd yelled at him. He tried the gas station next, then the library, and finally the hardware store. Nobody would hire a 13-year-old boy. By afternoon, his feet were tired, and Lucy was getting restless. That's when he saw the fancy black car pull up outside the town bank. Nathaniel Greaves stepped out, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Tommy's parents made in a month. Everyone knew Greaves. He owned half the businesses in town and had just bought the old Miller farm on the outskirts. Tommy gathered his courage. Maybe Mr. Greaves would have some work for him. He could clean cars, mow lawns, anything. With Lucy still under his arm, he approached the wealthy man. "Excuse me, Mr. Greaves." "Sir, I was wondering if you might have any work available. I'm stronger than I look, and I learn fast." Nathaniel Greaves turned slowly, looking down his nose at Tommy. His eyes went from the boy's worn-out sneakers to his second-hand clothes, and finally to Lucy the chicken. A cruel smile spread across his face. Well, well, you must be the Carter. Boy, I heard about your parents. Tragic." He didn't sound like he meant it. "And what's this, a chicken?" He started laughing, and several people nearby joined in nervously. "That's your inheritance, a chicken." Tommy held Lucy tighter. "She's a good chicken, sir. She lays eggs almost every day." This made Greaves laugh even harder. "1 egg a day? Boy, you'll be begging on the streets within a month. That's if you're lucky. Though I suppose that chicken might make a decent soup when you get hungry enough." The people around them laughed again, louder this time. Tommy felt his face turning. Charette, but he stood his ground. Lucy clucked indignantly as if she understood the insult. "We won't ever be hungry," Tommy said quietly. "And we won't beg either." Greaves wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Listen, boy, life isn't a fairy tale. One scrawny chicken won't save you from poverty. That's just the way things are. Now run along. I have important business to attend to." He turned his back on Tommy and walked into the bank. The small crowd that had gathered quickly dispersed, some giving Tommy pitying looks, others still chuckling about the chicken. Tommy walked home slowly, talking to Lucy the whole way. "Don't worry, girl. We'll show them. Somehow we'll show them all." Back at the small house, Tommy sat at the kitchen table where his mom used to serve him breakfast every morning. The house felt so empty now. He looked at the calendar on the wall. He had 23 days left before he'd have to leave. 23 days to figure out how to survive. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Mr. Greaves's words about ending up begging on the streets. He got up and went to check on Lucy in her small coop in the backyard. She was awake too, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "What are we going to do, Lucy?" he asked again. The chicken tilted her head and clucked softly. Then she did something she'd never done before. She laid an egg right there in the middle of the night. Tommy picked it up, feeling its warmth. That's when he had an idea. Not a big idea, not yet, but a start. His mom had always said Lucy's eggs were the best in town. "They're special," she'd say, because Lucy's a special chicken. Tommy had always thought she was just being nice, but now he wondered, what if she was right? The next morning, Tommy got up early. He took Lucy's egg from the night before and the fresh one she laid that morning. He cleaned them carefully, just like his mom used to do. Then he walked to the fancy part of town, where the rich people lived in big houses with perfectly kept lawns. He knocked on the first door, and a woman in expensive workout clothes answered. Before she could close the door, Tommy held up the eggs. "Ma'am, would you like to buy the freshest, most special eggs in town? They're from Lucy, the most amazing chicken you'll ever meet. $2 each." The woman started to say no, but something in Tommy's earnest face made her pause. Special eggs? What makes them special? Tommy thought quickly. Lucy only lays eggs for people she likes, and she laid these especially for you this morning. To his surprise, the woman smiled. Did she now? Well, I suppose I can't disappoint. Lucy, I'll take both. $4. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tommy thanked her and moved on to the next house. By the end of the morning, he had sold 6 eggs for $12. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. That night, Tommy sat with Lucy in the backyard. "We did good today, girl, but we need to do better. We need to make you the most famous chicken in town." Lucy clucked and pecked at some seeds Tommy had bought with part of their earnings. She seemed to be saying, "Just you wait and see what I can do." Tommy didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of something bigger than he could imagine, something that would change not just his life, but the whole town. And it all started with a boy and his chicken, proving that sometimes the smallest inheritance can lead to the biggest dreams. As he went to bed that night, Tommy thought about Mr. Greaves's cruel laughter. One day, he whispered to himself, one day he won't be laughing anymore. In the chicken coop, Lucy settled down to sleep too, but not before laying one more perfect egg, as if to say, tomorrow is another day, and we're just getting started. The stars twinkled overhead, watching over a boy who refused to give up, and a chicken who would help him prove that sometimes the greatest fortunes start with the smallest gifts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, Tommy had hope. And sometimes hope is all you need to start building a miracle. A week had passed since Tommy started selling Lucy's eggs. Every morning he'd wake up early, clean the eggs carefully, and go door to door in the rich part of town. Some people slammed their doors in his face, but others bought his eggs, charmed by his story about Lucy being a special chicken. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the biggest house on Maple Street, became his best customer. She bought eggs every other day and always told her friends about them. "These eggs make the most amazing omelets," she'd say. "They're different from store-bought eggs. The yolks are brighter and they taste better." Tommy knew he needed to make more money if he wanted to keep the rental house. 2 eggs a day wasn't enough. He sat in the backyard watching Lucy scratch in the dirt. "If only you could lay more eggs," he said to her. That's when he noticed something strange. Lucy was pecking at specific plants growing in the yard. Tommy remembered his mom talking about these plants. They were herbs that had grown wild in their yard for years. She used to say they made Lucy's eggs taste special. The next day, Tommy gathered some of these herbs and mixed them with Lucy's regular feed. To his amazement, she laid 3 eggs instead of her usual 2. And they looked different. The shells were smoother. And when he cracked one open to check, the yolk was an even brighter orange than before. Word started spreading around the wealthy neighborhood about the amazing eggs from the orphan boy's special chicken. Tommy raised his prices to $3 per egg, and people still bought them. Mrs. Henderson even offered to introduce him to the chef at the fancy country club where all the rich people ate. But not everyone was happy about Tommy's small success. Nathaniel Greaves owned the biggest supermarket in town, and he didn't like hearing that people were choosing Tommy's eggs over his store's eggs. One morning, he sent his store manager to talk to Tommy. "Listen, kid," the manager said, standing at Tommy's front door. "Mr. Greaves wants to make you an offer. He'll give you $50 for your chicken. That's more than you make in a week selling eggs." Tommy didn't even think about it. "Lucy's not for sale," he said firmly. "She's family." Manager frowned. "Don't be stupid, boy. You can't keep living here selling a few eggs. The rent's due in 2 weeks. Take the money while you can." But Tommy stood his ground. "Please tell Mr. Greaves that Lucy and I are doing just fine, and we're not going anywhere." That afternoon, Tommy went to see Mrs. Henderson. He told her about the herbs in his yard and how they made Lucy's eggs special. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully, then smiled. "Tommy dear, I think you might be onto something. Have you ever heard of organic farming?" Tommy shook his head. "Well," she continued, "people these days will pay extra for food that's grown naturally without chemicals. And if these herbs really make your eggs special..." She paused, thinking, "What if I introduced you to some people who might be interested in your story?" The next day, Mrs. Henderson took Tommy to meet her friend who owned the most popular breakfast restaurant in town. The owner, Mr. Chen, listened as Tommy explained about Lucy and the special herbs. "Show me," Mr. Chen said. Tommy brought out one of Lucy's eggs and cracked it into a pan. The chef's eyes widened when he saw the bright orange yolk. "I'll take all the eggs you can produce," Mr. Chen said, "and I'll pay $5 each." Tommy could hardly believe it. $5 per egg. But there was a problem. Lucy could only lay 2 or 3 eggs a day, even with the special herbs. He needed more chickens. That evening, Tommy sat in the backyard with Lucy. "We need help, girl," he said. "We need to find more chickens like you." Lucy clucked and pecked at the herbs growing nearby. Tommy watched her, remembering something his mom once told him about Lucy's mother being a special breed of chicken from a farm up north. "That's it," Tommy exclaimed. "We need to find your family." He ran inside and started searching through his mom's old recipe box where she kept important papers. In the back, he found a faded business card for Harrison's Heritage Hens, home of the golden layer chickens. Tommy couldn't believe his luck. The farm was only 2 towns over. But how would he get there? He didn't have a car, and the bus fare would cost more than he could afford. That's when he remembered Mrs. Henderson saying she wanted to help. Would she be willing to drive him to find more special chickens? The next morning, Tommy went to Mrs. Henderson's house early. He told her about finding the card and about his plan to get more chickens like Lucy. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Tommy, I've been looking for a good excuse to take a drive in the country. When do you want to go?" "Really? You'll take me?" Tommy could hardly believe his luck. "Of course. But first, we need to do some calculations. How much money have you saved from selling eggs?" Tommy had been keeping careful track in a notebook. $147, he said proudly. "And how much is your rent?" $400 a month, Tommy's voice dropped. Even with selling eggs at $5 each, he wouldn't make enough for rent. Mrs. Henderson thought for a moment. "Well then, we better make sure we find some good chickens tomorrow. And Tommy, I think it's time we made your egg business official. Have you ever heard of a business plan?" That night, Tommy could hardly sleep. He was excited about finding more chickens like Lucy, but he was also worried. What if the farm didn't exist anymore? What if they wouldn't sell him any chickens? What if this was all just a dream that would disappear? Lucy seemed to sense his worry. She came and sat next to him in the yard, clucking softly. Together they watched the sun set, not knowing that tomorrow would change everything. In his big mansion across town, Nathaniel Greaves was also making plans. He'd heard about Tommy's eggs being sold at the country club and about Mr. Chen's offer. This was no longer just about a boy and his chicken. This was becoming bad for business. Something would have to be done about young Tommy Carter and his special eggs. But for now, Tommy sat in his parents' small house, holding Lucy and dreaming of tomorrow. Sometimes the biggest dreams start with the smallest things, like a boy, a chicken, and a faded business card that might just hold the key to their future. Early the next morning, Mrs. Henderson picked Tommy up in her shiny blue car. Lucy sat in a special carrying cage in the back seat, coming along to help pick her new chicken friends. Tommy held his mum's recipe box tight in his lap, hoping the old business card would lead them to more special chickens. "Are you nervous?" Mrs. Henderson asked as they drove out of town. "A little," Tommy admitted. "What if they don't want to sell chickens to a kid?" Mrs. Henderson smiled. "That's why I'm here. And don't forget, you're not just any kid. You're a businessman now." The drive took 2 hours. They passed through small towns and farmland, following the GPS to Harrison's Heritage Hens. Tommy's heart sank when they turned onto an old dirt road and saw a weathered "For Sale" sign. But as they drove further, they saw chicken coops and a small farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney. An old man sat in a rocking chair on the porch, and several golden brown chickens that looked just like Lucy scratched in the yard. The man stood up as they parked. He was tall and thin, with white hair and kind eyes. "Can I help you folks?" Tommy got out of the car holding Lucy's cage. "Are you Mr. Harrison?" "That's right, though most people call me Old Joe." He peered at Lucy. "Well, now that's one of my golden layers, isn't she? Haven't bred those in years." Tommy explained about his parents buying Lucy as a chick and about discovering how special her eggs were. He told Old Joe about selling the eggs and about Mr. Chen's offer to buy all he could produce. Old Joe listened carefully, then laughed. "So that's why people have been calling about my chickens lately. Your eggs are becoming famous, son." "People have been calling?" Tommy asked hopefully. Old Joe's smile faded. "Yeah, including some fellow named Greaves, offered to buy my whole farm yesterday. But I told him no, this place isn't for sale, no matter what that sign says. My daughter put it up, thinks I'm too old to run the farm." He sighed. "Truth is, she might be right." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Maybe we could help each other. Tommy needs more chickens like Lucy, and you need help with the farm." Old Joe looked interested. "What did you have in mind, ma'am?" While they talked, Tommy explored the farm with Lucy. There were about 20 golden layer chickens, all healthy and beautiful. Old Joe showed him the special feed mix he used, which included the same herbs that grew in Tommy's yard. "These chickens are special," Old Joe explained. "My grandfather bred them. They lay fewer eggs than regular chickens, but their eggs are better, more nutritious. People used to come from miles around to buy them." "Why did you stop selling them?" Tommy asked. Old Joe's face grew sad. "Big farms took over. People wanted cheaper eggs. Then my wife passed away, and I couldn't keep up with everything myself." He brightened a bit. "But you remind me of myself. At your age. Got my first chicken when I was 12. Mrs. Henderson had been taking notes. Now she spoke up. "Mr. Harrison, what if we made you a proposal? Tommy needs a mentor and more chickens. You need help with the farm. What if we worked out a partnership?" They spent the next hour talking business. Mrs. Henderson helped them make a plan. Old Joe would teach Tommy everything about raising golden layer chickens. Tommy would help on the farm and get to take 10 chickens home. They would split the egg profits, and eventually, Tommy would learn to breed the chickens himself. "But how will I get to the farm?" Tommy asked. It was too far to walk. "I'll drive." "You," Mrs. Henderson said. 3 times a week after school, we can bring the eggs to Mr. Chen on the way back." Old Joe liked the idea of teaching someone his family's chicken-raising secrets. "These birds are special," he said. "They deserve someone who'll take care of them, right?" But just as they were finishing their plan, a fancy black car drove up. Tommy's heart sank as Nathaniel Greaves stepped out. "Joe Harrison," Greaves called out. "I've come to make you a better offer for this farm." Then he saw Tommy and Mrs. Henderson. His face darkened. "What are you doing here, boy?" Before Tommy could answer, Old Joe stepped forward. "Sorry, Mr. Greaves, but I've already made a deal with this young man right here." Greaves laughed. "A deal? With a child? Be serious, Harrison. I'm offering real money." "Money isn't everything," Old Joe said firmly. "This boy understands what's special about these chickens. He'll keep their legacy alive." Greaves' face turned red with anger. "You're making a mistake, both of you." He looked at Tommy. "This isn't over, boy. You can't compete with me. I'll make sure of that." After Greaves left, Tommy felt scared. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. I don't want to cause trouble. But Old Joe put a hand on his shoulder. "Son, people like Greaves think they can buy anything they want. But some things aren't for sale, like heritage, like doing things the right way, like determination." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "And you're not alone anymore, Tommy. You've got friends now." That evening, Tommy went home with 10 new chickens, all sisters to Lucy. Old Joe helped him set up proper coops in his small backyard. The chickens settled in quickly, seeming to know they were home. As the sun set, Tommy sat watching his new flock. Lucy walked among her sisters like she was showing them around. Tomorrow, he would start learning from Old Joe. Tomorrow, he would begin building something special. But in his big house across town, Nathaniel Greaves was making phone calls. If he couldn't buy Harrison's farm, he'd find another way to stop this competition. No child with a bunch of chickens was going to threaten his business empire. The war between a powerful businessman and a determined boy, was about to begin. But tonight, Tommy didn't know about the troubles ahead. Tonight, he just watched his chickens and dreamed about tomorrow. The next few weeks were the busiest of Tommy's life. Every morning, he woke up at 5 to collect eggs and clean the coops. His new chickens were laying well, giving him around 20 eggs a day. Mr. Chen bought most of them for his restaurant, and Tommy's regular customers bought the rest. Mrs. Henderson drove him to Old Joe's farm 3 times a week after school. The old farmer taught him everything about raising golden layer chickens, their special feed mix, how to keep them healthy, and the secrets of breeding them properly. "These birds need love," Old Joe would say. "They know when someone cares about them. That's what makes their eggs so special." Tommy was making enough money now to pay his rent, but new problems kept coming up. First, the health inspector showed up at his door. "We've received a complaint," the inspector said, looking at his clipboard, "about unauthorized livestock in a residential area." Tommy's heart sank. He knew who must have complained: Nathaniel Greaves. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Henderson's car pulled up. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, stepping out. She knew the inspector from her charity work. "Mrs. Henderson, this is your project?" "Yes, Robert. Tommy is running a licensed small business under my supervision. All his permits are in order." She pulled out a folder of paperwork she'd helped Tommy file. "And the zoning allows for small-scale urban farming." The inspector looked relieved. He signed off on the inspection and left, but Tommy knew this was just the beginning. He was right. The next day, the supermarket owned by Greaves started selling eggs at half price. Fresh farm eggs, better than organic, the sign said. Tommy's regular customers started asking why his eggs cost so much more. "We have to do something," Tommy told Mrs. Henderson. "I can't lower my prices. The chickens need their special feed." Mrs. Henderson thought for a moment. "Then we need to prove why your eggs are worth more. I have an idea." She took Tommy to meet her friend who wrote for the local newspaper. The reporter loved the story. A young orphan working with an old farmer to save a heritage breed of chickens. She wrote a big article about Tommy, Old Joe, and their special golden layer chickens. The story ran on Sunday, with pictures of Tommy and his flock. By Monday morning, he had more customers than eggs to sell. Mr. Chen was worried. "I need those eggs for my restaurant," he said. "My customers come especially for the omelets made with your eggs." Tommy had another problem too. The feed store suddenly stopped carrying the special herbs his chickens needed. When he went to ask why, the owner looked embarrassed. "Sorry, kid, Mr. Greaves bought the store last week. He's changing our suppliers." Old Joe helped Tommy plant the herbs in his backyard, but they would take time to grow. They had to drive 2 towns over to buy feed now, which cost more money. Then something even worse happened. Tommy came home from school one day to find 3 of his chickens sick. The others didn't look good either. "Something's wrong with their water," Old Joe said when he came to check. He tasted it and spit it out. "There's something in here. Someone's been tampering with your water supply." Tommy felt scared. Would Greaves really go this far to stop him? That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He sat in the yard with his chickens, worried sick. Lucy came and sat in his lap, like she knew he needed comforting. "I don't know what to do," he told her. "Maybe Mr. Greaves is too powerful to fight." But then he remembered something his mom used to say: "Running away from bullies only makes them stronger." The next morning, Tommy went to see Mrs. Henderson. To his surprise, Mr. Chen was there too, along with several other business owners from town. "We've been talking," Mrs. Henderson said, "about what's happening to you, and we've decided it's time to take a stand against Nathaniel Greaves." Mr. Chen spoke up. "My restaurant isn't the only one that wants your eggs. Every good restaurant in town is tired of dealing with Greaves's monopoly on supplies. We're going to help you expand," Mrs. Henderson said. "Properly this time, with security cameras for the chicken coops, a real water filtration system, and enough money to buy the vacant lot next door to your house." Tommy could hardly believe it. "But why would you all help me?" An older man Tommy recognized as the owner of the Italian restaurant downtown answered, "Because this town needs to. Remember, there's more to business than just money. It's about community, about helping each other, about doing things the right way." They helped Tommy draw up a real business plan. The vacant lot would become Carter Family Farm, with proper coops and an herb garden. They'd sell eggs to restaurants and at the farmers market. and even start teaching other kids about urban farming. But when Tommy went home that evening, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks, he found a notice taped to his door. His landlord was selling the house to Greaves Properties. The notice said he had 30 days to move out. Tommy sat on his front steps, holding the paper. Everything he'd worked for was here. The coops, the herb garden, his whole life. Where would he go? What would happen to his chickens? Lucy came and pecked at his shoes, then looked up at him with her bright eyes. She'd never given up, not even when she was the only chicken he had. Now he had a whole flock of special chickens and people who believed in him. "No," Tommy said out loud, "we're not giving up. This is our home." He didn't know it yet, but the real battle was just beginning. Across town, in his big mansion, Nathaniel Greaves was about to learn that sometimes the smallest opponents can be the hardest to beat. The next morning, Tommy woke up early as usual to take care of his chickens, but today was different. As he worked, he could hear the sounds of construction across the street. Greaves Properties was building a new supermarket there, even bigger than their other one in town. Mrs. Henderson arrived just as Tommy finished collecting the morning eggs. When he showed her the eviction notice, her face turned serious. "This has gone too far," she said. "It's time to call my son." Tommy knew her son was a lawyer in the city, but he'd never met him. An hour later, David Henderson pulled up in a fancy car, wearing a suit that reminded Tommy of Greaves. But David's kind eyes were just like his mother's. "So you're the chicken boy Mum keeps talking about," David said, smiling. He read the eviction notice carefully. "Interesting, very interesting." "Can they really make me leave?" Tommy asked. "They're trying to," David said. "But they might have made a mistake. You see, there are laws about evicting minors, especially orphans, and there are more laws about trying to force out small business owners unfairly." He made some phone calls, speaking in big legal words Tommy didn't understand. But by lunchtime, David was smiling again. "Good news. The eviction notice isn't legal. They have to give you more time, and they have to provide a good reason for the eviction. Being a competitor isn't a good enough reason." Tommy felt relieved, but David wasn't finished. "There's more. Mom told me about the water tampering and the feed store problem. Those things are illegal too. If we can prove Greaves is behind it all, he'll be in big trouble." "But how can we prove it?" That's when old Joe arrived, driving his old pickup truck. "Maybe I can help with that," he said. "The feed store owner is an old friend of mine. He might be willing to talk about what really happened." They spent the afternoon gathering evidence. The feed store owner admitted Greaves had threatened to bankrupt him if he kept selling to Tommy. 2 construction workers from the new supermarket site confessed they'd been paid to mess with Tommy's water supply. David wrote everything down. "This is good," he said, "really good, but we need more." Help came from an unexpected source. That evening, a fancy car pulled up to Tommy's house. A woman in expensive clothes stepped out. It was Mrs. Greaves. "I know what my husband's been doing," she said, "and I can't stay quiet anymore. He's always been ruthless in business, but going after a child? That's too far." She had papers, emails and documents showing how Greaves had planned to drive Tommy out of business. "He's obsessed with beating you," she said. "He can't stand that someone so young could challenge him." David was thrilled with the evidence, but Tommy felt strange. He didn't want to hurt anyone, even Greaves. He just wanted to raise his chickens and make his parents proud. The next day, the local newspaper ran another story about Tommy, this time about how Greaves was trying to shut down his business. People were angry. A crowd gathered outside Greaves's supermarket, carrying signs that said, "Support local farms" and "Stop bullying Tommy." Mr. Chen and other restaurant owners announced they would stop buying from Greaves's stores. The feed store owner put up a sign saying he would start carrying Tommy's special herbs again, no matter what Greaves said. But Greaves wasn't done fighting. He called a press conference outside his new supermarket construction site. "This boy is operating an illegal farm in a residential area," he announced to the cameras. "He's breaking health codes and zoning laws. His eggs aren't properly inspected. He's putting people at risk." That's when the health inspector stepped forward from the crowd. "Actually, Mr. Greaves, that's not true. I've inspected Tommy's operation myself. His standards are higher than most commercial farms. The state agricultural inspector spoke up next. We've tested his eggs. They have higher nutritional content than any others we've seen. Those golden layer chickens are something special. One by one, people defended Tommy. Old Joe talked about the heritage breed chickens and their importance. Mrs. Henderson spoke about how Tommy had built his business honestly and worked hard every day. Mr. Chen described how Tommy's eggs had made his restaurant famous. Greaves looked around at the crowd, his face getting redder and redder. But before he could say anything else, his wife stepped up to the microphone. "Nathaniel," she said clearly, "enough is enough. You're destroying your own reputation trying to crush a young boy's dream. Is that really who you want to be?" The crowd went quiet. Everyone watched as Greaves looked at his wife, then at Tommy, then at all the people supporting the young farmer. For the first time, Greaves seemed to realize how he looked to others, a wealthy man using his power to bully an orphan who was just trying to survive. Tommy stepped forward. "Mr. Greaves," he said, his voice shaking a little but growing stronger, "I never wanted to be your enemy. I just wanted to take care of my chickens and make my parents proud. Maybe there's a better way for both of us." The reporters leaned in closer. The crowd held their breath. Even Lucy, who was sitting in her travel cage nearby, Tommy took her everywhere important, stopped clucking to watch. What happened next would change everything in their small town. But standing there, waiting for Greaves to respond, Tommy realized something important. Sometimes the biggest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from finding a way to turn them into friends. Nathaniel Greaves stood at the microphone for a long moment, looking at Tommy. The crowd waited silently. Even the construction workers at the new supermarket site stopped their machines to watch. Finally, Greaves spoke. "What do you mean, a better way?" Tommy took a deep breath. "Well, sir, you're building this big new supermarket and you want to sell the best products, right?" Greaves nodded slowly. What if you had something nobody else has, something special?" Tommy pointed to Lucy in her cage. "These golden layer chickens are really rare. Old Joe says they're probably the last ones in the country. Their eggs are special, everyone says so. What if instead of fighting, we work together?" Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "The boy's right, Nathaniel. Think about it. Your new supermarket could have an exclusive line of premium eggs, the only golden layer eggs available anywhere. And," Old Joe added, "you could help save a heritage breed from disappearing. That's worth something too." Greaves looked thoughtful. He was a businessman after all, and he knew a good opportunity when he saw one. "What exactly are you proposing?" Tommy hadn't planned this far ahead, but the words came naturally. "You help me build a proper farm. Not just in my backyard, but a real farm where we can raise more golden layers. Your supermarket gets to sell our eggs exclusively, and..." He looked at Old Joe, who nodded encouragingly. "We teach other kids about farming too, like a community project." Mrs. Greaves touched her husband's arm. "Darling, think how good this would be for your image. Instead of the big businessman who bullies children, you'd be the one who helps them learn and grow." The change in Greaves didn't happen all at once. First, his shoulders relaxed, then the angry lines around his mouth softened. Finally, he actually smiled. "You're a clever boy, Tommy Carter. Almost as clever as those chickens of yours." He held out his hand. "Let's talk details." The crowd broke into applause. Reporters started snapping pictures. Lucy clucked loudly, as if she was celebrating too. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The new supermarket plans were modified to include a special Carter's Corner section that would sell Tommy's eggs and other local products. Behind the store, where there had been empty lots, Greaves helped build the Carter family teaching farm. Old Joe moved his remaining chickens to the new farm, saying it was time to retire from his old place. "But I'm not really retiring," he told Tommy. "Just changing jobs. These city folks need to learn about real farming." The teaching farm became something special. School groups came to learn about raising chickens. Other kids who wanted to start their own small businesses got advice and help. Tommy even started a program where families could adopt a chicken, learning to care for it and sharing in the eggs it produced. Mrs. Henderson helped set up a proper business structure, with Tommy as the youngest CEO in town, but he never let that go to his head. Every morning he still got up early to care for the chickens himself. Greaves changed too. Working with Tommy seemed to remind him of when he first started in business, before it was all about money and power. He started helping other small business owners instead of trying to push them out. One morning, about 6 months after their agreement, Greaves came to the farm early. He found Tommy in the chicken yard, talking to Lucy while he scattered feed. "You know," Greaves said, "I never properly apologized for how I treated you in the beginning." Tommy shrugged. "It worked out okay in the end." "Yes, it did. But I learned something important from you, Tommy. Success isn't just about being the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's about finding ways to help each other grow." Tommy smiled. "That's what Lucy taught me. Even when she was my only chicken, she never stopped trying her best. And she was always willing to share with the other chickens when they came along." Greaves looked at Lucy, who was strutting around importantly, showing the newer chickens where the best seeds were. "Smart bird," he said. "Maybe we could all learn something from her." The morning sun rose higher, lighting up the teaching farm. Children would be arriving soon for their lessons. Old Joe was already in the classroom, setting up for today's session on proper egg collecting. Mrs. Henderson would bring another group of business students in the afternoon. Tommy looked around at everything that had grown from his parents' last gift to him, one special chicken who never gave up. Lucy clucked and rubbed against his leg, the same way she used to when it was just the two of them in that small backyard. "You know what, Mr. Greaves," Tommy said, "I think my parents would be proud. Not just of me, but of how everyone came together to make this happen." Greaves put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "They would be very proud, son. Very proud indeed." A year had passed since Tommy and Greaves shook hands in front of the construction site. The Carter family teaching farm had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The chicken coops now housed over 100 golden layer chickens, all descended from Lucy and her sisters. But more importantly, the farm had become the heart of the community. One morning, Tommy was showing a group of kids how to collect eggs when he noticed a small girl hanging back from the others. She reminded him of himself a year ago, quiet, sad, and a little lost. "Would you like to meet Lucy?" he asked her. The girl nodded shyly. "Is she really the chicken that started everything?" "She sure is." Tommy called Lucy over. Even though she was older now, Lucy was still the queen of the farm. She came right away, clucking softly. "My name's Sarah," the girl whispered, gently petting Lucy. "My mom says you were all alone too before Lucy." Tommy learned that Sarah's father had recently passed away, just like his parents. She and her mother were struggling to keep their small flower shop open. "You know," Tommy said, "chickens aren't the only things that can make a business special. What makes your mom's flowers different from the ones at the big stores?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Mom grows her own. She has all these special kinds that you can't find anywhere else. But not enough people know about our shop." That gave Tommy an idea. He talked to Greaves about adding a flower section to Carter's Corner in the supermarket. Soon Sarah and her mom were supplying special flowers to both the supermarket and the teaching farm, where they started giving classes about flower growing alongside the chicken raising lessons. The teaching farm kept growing in other ways too. Old Joe started a program teaching kids about heritage farming. Mrs. Henderson brought business students from the local college to learn about sustainable small businesses. Even Greaves taught classes about how big and small businesses could work together. But the most special thing about the farm was how it helped people find hope. Like Billy, a tough teenager who everyone said was headed for trouble. He came to the farm on a school trip and fell in love with the chickens. Now he worked there after school, saving money to start his own farm someday. Or Mrs. Chen, who lost her husband and almost sold their restaurant. The farm's community helped her keep it going, and now it was more successful than ever, famous for its special recipes using golden layer eggs. One day, a TV crew came to do a story about the farm. The reporter asked Tommy what made it so special. "It's not just about chickens or eggs," Tommy said. "It's about believing in yourself and helping others believe in themselves too. Everyone has something special to offer. just like every chicken here lays slightly different eggs. But when we work together, that's when amazing things happen. The reporter looked skeptical. But you're just a kid. How do you manage all this? I'm not alone, Tommy smiled. Look around. The camera panned across the farm. Old Joe was teaching a group about proper feed mixing. Mrs. Henderson was helping a young girl write a business plan. Greaves was giving a tour to some visiting businessmen who wanted to start similar programs in their own towns. Sarah and her mum were arranging flowers for tomorrow's market day. Billy was carefully checking the nesting boxes. Mrs. Chen was teaching a cooking class using fresh eggs, and Lucy was supervising it all, strutting around importantly, like she knew she'd started something special. You see, Tommy continued, when my parents died, I thought I was alone except for Lucy, but I wasn't really alone. I just hadn't found my flock yet. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Tommy sat in the garden with Lucy. The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors, reminding him of that day a year ago when he'd thought everything was lost. We've come a long way, haven't we, girl? He said to Lucy. She clucked softly and settled next to him just like she used to do in their small backyard. A cool breeze carried the scent of Sarah's flowers and the sound of chickens settling down for the night. Across the yard, Tommy could see the lights of Greaves' supermarket. The sign for Carter's Corner glowed warmly. Inside, he knew the special. Egg section was probably almost empty. They sold out almost every day now. But tomorrow would bring new eggs, new students, new chances to help people find their own special gifts. Tomorrow would bring new dreams to grow. Lucy pecked gently at Tommy's shoe, her way of saying it was time to close up for the night. As they walked to the coops, Tommy heard a car pull up. It was Mrs. Henderson coming back to drop off some papers. Almost. Forgot, she said, handing him an envelope. This came today. It was a letter from a farm in another state. They'd heard about the golden layer chickens and the teaching program. They wanted to start something similar in their community. Tommy smiled. Maybe Lucy's family was about to get even bigger. The letter from the out-of-state farm was just the beginning. After the TV story aired, more letters started arriving. People from all over the country wanted to know about Tommy's farm and the golden layer chickens. You're going to need help handling all this, Mrs. Henderson said one morning, watching. Tommy sort through another stack of mail. Maybe it's time to think bigger. Tommy looked around his office, which had once been just a small shed. Pictures covered the walls, the original backyard with Lucy. The first group of students at the teaching farm, Sarah and her mum's flower garden, Billy graduating from high school. He was going to agricultural college in the fall. I don't know, Tommy said. What if getting bigger means losing what makes this place special? That's when Greaves knocked on the door. He wasn't wearing his usual business suit, but rather casual clothes and work boots, his new standard outfit for farm visits. Tommy, we need to talk about something. He sat down, looking serious. Remember how you taught me that success isn't just about being the biggest? Tommy nodded. Well, sometimes being bigger isn't about power, it's about helping more people. Greaves pulled out some papers. I've been talking to my business contacts. There are communities all over the country that could use something like what we've built here. Mrs. Henderson smiled. That's what I've been thinking too. What if we created a program to help other towns start their own teaching farms? Tommy thought about it. But what about the golden layer chickens? Old Joe says we have to be careful about breeding them right. That's why I came early today, Old Joe said, walking in. He'd obviously been part of this conversation before. Been training Billy real good. He can handle the breeding program here while we help set up new farms. Tommy looked at Lucy, who was sitting in her special basket in the corner of the office. She always seemed to know when important decisions were being made. She clucked softly as if giving her approval. But how would it work? Tommy asked. That's when Sarah poked her head in. She wasn't so shy anymore. Running the flower program had given her confidence. Maybe the same way you helped me and Mom, by showing people how to find what makes them special. They spent the morning planning. Each new farm would start with a pair of golden layer chickens, properly bred from Lucy's line. But more importantly, they would learn the principles that had made Carter Family Farm successful. Community involvement, teaching others, and finding ways to help people believe in themselves. Mrs. Chen brought lunch for everyone. Her restaurant now had 3 locations, all featuring special golden layer egg dishes. As they ate, more ideas came up. "We could have a scholarship program," Mrs. Henderson suggested. "Help kids like Billy go to agricultural school." "And a small business training program," Greaves added, "teaching people how to start and run their own farms and related businesses." "Don't forget about the heritage part," Old Joe said. "These chickens aren't just special because of their eggs. They're special because they connect us to the past while helping us build the future." Tommy listened to everyone's ideas, remembering how it all started. With one chicken, one boy, and one simple dream of survival. Now that dream had grown into something that could help people everywhere. "Okay," he said finally, "but we have to do it right. Every farm needs to feel like family, just like ours does." They called it the Golden Layer Project. The plan was to start with 5 new farms in different states. Each one would be matched with a family or group that shared Tommy's vision of community and teaching. The first new farm opened 6 months later in a small town in Ohio. Tommy and Lucy flew there. Lucy had her own special carrier and first-class treatment. The airline had never had such an important chicken passenger. The town reminded Tommy of his own a year ago. The main street had empty stores. Young people were leaving because they couldn't find opportunities. But there was also hope. People who wanted to make things better. The new farm would be run by a retired teacher and her daughter. They had land but didn't know how to use it. Now, watching them hold their first pair of golden layer chickens, Lucy had personally approved them, Tommy saw the same look in their eyes that he'd had when he first started. "Remember," he told them, "the chickens are special, but the real magic comes from bringing people together." Back home, things kept growing too. Sarah's flower program had expanded to include a whole garden center. Billy was doing great at college and had already started planning improvements to the breeding program. Mrs. Chen was teaching cooking classes 3 times a week. Even Greaves had changed. He was known now as the businessman who helped small farms succeed. One evening, Tommy sat with Lucy in their special spot behind the main coop. The farm was quiet except for the soft clucking of chickens settling down for the night. "Did you know this would happen?" he asked her. "When we were alone in that backyard, did you know we'd end up helping so many people?" Lucy just clucked softly and settled against his leg, like she always had. Some things hadn't changed, even though everything else had. A car pulled up, more visitors from another town interested in starting their own farm. Tommy stood up, brushing off his jeans. Lucy followed him, ready to help inspect another potential farm family. "Time to help more dreams grow," Tommy said. Lucy clucked in agreement. After all, that's what special chickens do. They help dreams take flight. 2 years had passed since Tommy first stood in his backyard with just Lucy and a dream. The Golden Layer Project now had farms in 12 states. Each one was different, but they all shared the same spirit, helping people find their own special gifts. One morning, Tommy was giving a tour to a group from the state government when his phone rang. It was Mrs. Henderson, and she sounded urgent. "Tommy, you need to come to the children's home right away. There's someone you should meet." The children's home was new, built on land donated by Greaves next to the teaching farm. It was a place where orphaned children could stay while learning about farming and business. Tommy went there often to talk with the kids. When he arrived, Mrs. Henderson was sitting with a small boy who looked about 10 years old. The boy was holding something wrapped in a blanket. "Tommy, this is Michael," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "His parents passed away last week in a car accident. When the social workers were helping him pack, he refused to leave without." "Well, why don't you show him, Michael?" The boy carefully unwrapped the blanket. Inside was a small, golden brown chicken. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. "Is that?" Michael nodded. "She's a golden layer. My dad bought her from your farm last year. He said she was special." His voice trembled. "She's all I have left of them." Tommy sat down next to Michael. "What's her name?" "Hope," Michael whispered. "Dad said that's what your first chicken gave you, so that's what we named her." Tommy looked at Mrs. Henderson, who had tears in her eyes. "Michael's aunt lives too far away to take him," she explained. "He needs a home. And he needs to stay with Hope," Tommy finished. He understood perfectly that evening. Tommy called a special meeting at the farm. Everyone came. Greaves and his wife, old Joe, Mrs. Chen, Sarah and her mum Billy, home from college for the weekend, and of course Mrs. Henderson. Lucy sat in her special place, watching as always. Michael and Hope need a home, Tommy said. But more than that, they need a family, like all of you were for me. They talked late into the night making plans. The children's home had space, but this was about more than just a place to stay. This was about giving Michael what Tommy had found, a chance to turn his loss into something good. The next day, Tommy took Michael on a tour of the farm. Hope came too, riding in Michael's arms just like Lucy used to ride in Tommy's. "You know," Tommy said, "when my parents died, I thought Lucy was all I had, but she turned out to be just the beginning. She helped me find a whole new family." Michael looked around at the busy farm, children learning about chickens, Sarah teaching a flower arranging class, Mrs. Chen cooking with fresh eggs, Billy checking on the newest batch of chicks. Could I learn to do all this too?" Michael asked. "You already have a head start," Tommy smiled. "You have Hope." Over the next few weeks, Michael started to come out of his shell. He helped with the chickens every morning before school. Hope turned out to be a wonderful teaching chicken, gentle with the younger children who visited the farm. One day, Michael had an idea of his own. "What if we started a special program for kids like me? Kids who lost their parents. We could help them find their own special thing, like you did with the chickens." Tommy took this idea to the next Golden Layer project meeting. Soon, every teaching farm in the network was working with local children's services, creating programs to help orphaned children find hope through farming, animals, and community. They called it the Hope Program, and Michael became its first success story. He started teaching other children how to care for chickens, just like Tommy had taught him. Hope became the program's mascot, proud mother to a new line of teaching chickens. One evening, Tommy found Michael sitting in the garden, talking to Hope, just like Tommy used to talk to Lucy. "I used to think losing my parents was the end of everything," Michael said. "But it was really a beginning, wasn't it? Just like it was for you." Tommy sat down next to him. Lucy came over and settled between them, with Hope right beside her. The old chicken and the younger one clucked softly together, like they were sharing secrets. "That's the thing about endings," Tommy said. "Sometimes they're just the start of an even better story." From their special spot, they could see the lights coming on at the children's home. New children had arrived today, each carrying their own sadness, each needing to find their own path to hope. But they wouldn't have to do it alone. They had the farm, the community, and now the Hope Program. And of course, they had the chickens, generations of golden layers, each one special in its own way, each one ready to help another dream take flight. Michael leaned back, looking at the stars starting to appear in the evening sky. "Do you think my parents would be proud, like yours are of you?" Tommy put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "I know they are. And you know what? They'd be proud. Not just because you're doing well, but because you're helping others do well too. That's what makes this farm special. We all help each other grow." 5 years had passed since Tommy first stood alone in his backyard, with just Lucy and a dream. The Golden Layer Project now had farms in every state, each one helping people find their own special gifts. The Hope Program had helped hundreds of orphaned children find new purpose through farming and community. Today was a special day at the original Carter family teaching farm. People had come from all over the country to celebrate the farm's 5th anniversary. The parking lot was full of cars, and the air was filled with the smell of Mrs. Chen's famous golden layer egg dishes and the sweet scent of Sarah's flowers. Tommy stood on the small stage they'd set up in front of the main coop, looking out at the crowd. He saw familiar faces everywhere. Billy, now graduated from agricultural college, stood with his group of student farmers. Old Joe sat in the front row, his eyes twinkling with pride. Mrs. Henderson was there with her son. David, who had helped so many other farms get started, Greaves and his wife sat nearby, looking nothing like the proud, cold people they'd once been. Next to them was Michael, now 15, with Hope perched contentedly in his lap. The Hope Program. Kids filled several rows, each with their own stories of finding new beginnings at the farm. In a special padded basket on the stage sat Lucy, older now but still the queen of the farm. She watched everything with the same bright eyes, that had once given a lonely, frightened boy the courage to keep going. Tommy stepped up to the microphone. 5 years ago, I thought I had lost everything. My parents were gone, and all I had left was one chicken that everyone laughed at. He smiled at Lucy. But sometimes the smallest gifts turn out to be the biggest blessings. He told the story of those early days, the cruel laughter, the struggles, the people who helped him along the way. He talked about how enemies had become friends, how one small farm had grown into a nationwide movement. But the real story isn't about chickens or eggs or even farms, Tommy said. It's about hope. It's about community. It's about believing that no matter how dark things seem, tomorrow can be better if we help each other. As if on cue, Lucy stood up in her basket and clucked loudly. The crowd laughed, then broke into applause. After the ceremony, people shared stories about how the Golden Layer Project had changed their lives. A woman from Ohio told how her teaching farm had brought her dying town back to life. A man from Texas explained how the Hope program had helped his daughter find purpose after losing her mother. Michael had his own announcement. He'd been accepted to agricultural college just like Billy. He wanted to help expand the Hope program to even more farms. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned out. Tommy walked through the farm with Lucy, stopping to look at the pictures that lined the walls of every building. Hundreds of stories of hope and healing, all starting with one boy and one chicken. They came to the small garden where Tommy's parents were buried. He'd moved them here when the farm was built, planting Sarah's flowers all around. Lucy settled at his feet as he stood looking at the headstones. "I think they'd be proud," said a voice behind him. It was Greaves. "Not just of what you've built, but of how you built it. You never lost your kindness, even when I was cruel to you. You taught me that true success isn't about winning over others. It's about helping others win too." Tommy nodded. "That's what Lucy taught me. Every morning she'd share her food with the other chickens. Every day she'd do her best to lay eggs that would help us survive. She never gave up and she never stopped caring." As if understanding she was being talked about, Lucy clucked softly and pecked gently at Tommy's shoe, just like she used to do in that small backyard so long ago. More people were arriving for the evening celebration. The farm was lit up with strings of lights, and music played softly in the background. The Hope Program kids were giving tours to visitors, proudly showing off their own special projects. Tommy looked around at it all, the teaching farm, the children's home, the community that had grown from one small act of kindness. He remembered standing in his old backyard, holding Lucy and wondering how they would survive. "Ready to go back to the party?" Greaves asked. "In a minute," Tommy said. He knelt down next to Lucy. "Thank you, girl, for everything." Lucy clucked and rubbed against his hand, as loving as she'd been on that first sad day when she was all he had left in the world. Together, they walked back to join the celebration. The night air was filled with laughter and hope, and the stars twinkled overhead like promises of dreams yet to come. On a perch near the stage, Lucy settled in to watch over her farm family. She might be just a chicken to some, but she knew the truth. Sometimes the smallest creatures can inspire the biggest changes. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of faith, one heart brave enough to keep hoping. And as the celebration continued into the night, the story of the boy and his chicken lived on, not just in the farms they'd helped create or the lives they'd helped change, but in the simple truth they'd taught the world. That hope, like love, only grows stronger when you share it with others. The end.